It's a great pleasure for me to be here. And this morning, we are going to talk about CCUS and EOR. And I'm going to very briefly touch the subject because we cannot talk about a lot of things in 20 minutes. But we'll make sure this is a little bit about my background. And I'm not going to spend too much time regarding my background, but we have a website, and that information is available. But right from 1973, after my graduation from Penn State, I had been working on fluid injection projects all around the world. And as Dr. Milland showed here, the importance of the fossil fuel energy is still very important. But we have to be sure that we do these things in a very responsible way. It is Dr. Scott Tinker is going to be giving a presentation during the lunch today. He has said that it is important for us to have sustainable, reliable, and cost-effective energy source, which also addresses the environmental concerns. So this is very important for us to be working together in these areas. Let's face the fact, the scientific consensus is that it will be almost impossible to reach net zero emissions by 2050 without a significant global scale-up of CCS. So CCS, CCUS, and I believe enhanced oil recovery using CCUS and carbon capture and storage is going to play a very important role. This is our team at University of Houston. I have just highlighted a few names here. We have a variety of expertise available here, and we are looking forward to working with the University of Utah, Bob McPherson and his team very, very closely, and we are also going to have a special session with them tomorrow morning. So let's look at where did CO2 EOR all started. It started in 1972 in the Sac Rock unit in Snyder, Texas. That's where it started. Long time ago. So we have a history of over 50 years of CO2 injection. And I had the pleasure of working in Snyder, Texas for a year on this project. And it really has been a great project since then. Now we see over 140 projects in the US, all commercial scale. Right now, the big players include companies like Oxy, and then other companies are also involved, but a lot of CO2 EOR successful projects going on. And there's a lot of debate about CO2 projects, whether they work from enhanced oil recovery point of view or not. When I worked in Chevron, almost 40 years, there was a lot of debate early on. Is this really an EOR project? Does it really give you values? And finally, I was convinced, and most people in the company were completely convinced that CO2 EOR is really a viable way of increasing oil production. So this is an example. We took a portion of the field, and we made sure that that field was almost at the residual oil saturation. And then we came in with CO2 injection, and what we find here is a big bump in oil production. So this methodology works very, very well. And based upon these pilots, based upon these experiments, other companies came in the Permian Basin, Shell, BP, ExxonMobil, other companies came in, and they all started doing successful CO2 projects. As I mentioned earlier, today, Oxy plays a very, very important role. We really don't have to go over the theoretical aspects. the CO2 flood, but this slide just shows very clearly that CO2 is playing a very important role. But if you go to any CO2 project, it looks like upstream expertise are very important at subsurface scale. But at the surface, it looks like all chemical engineering operations. Pretty much, almost like a little bit of refinery, little bit of separation, little bit of compression. All of these things play a very important role. I worked on projects in Kazakhstan, the Tengiz field for Chevron, and same thing you see there. Underground is all subsurface expertise. At the surface is all chemical engineering and refinery type of expertise required. So really, we integrate these things very, very well in this area. As I pointed out earlier, there are over 140 CO2 EOR projects successfully running in the US. And all over the world, 80 million tons per annum of CO2 is getting injected at this point in time in these projects. However, over 80% of the CO2 injected is not anthropogenic. They are CO2 coming in from natural reservoirs. So one of the lowest hanging fruits that we have at this point in time is to make those CO2 injection anthropogenic. And I must tell you one thing, people may not know this, the first CO2 project in the world, SACROC, was actually an anthropogenic project. Because at that time, natural CO2 did not exist. So we were collecting CO2 from the gas plants. And that CO2 was getting injected in SACROC. So SACROC showed the anthropogenic CO2 was the way to go. We were very fortunate at the University of Houston. I had a $5 million research grant from Oil India Limited. So we screened 50 of their reservoirs containing 2.5 billion barrels of oil in place. And almost all of those reservoirs are amenable to CO2 injection. And Milan, the beauty of those reservoirs are they all have aquifers below them, 10 times larger than the reservoir volume or even larger. So there is a tremendous potential to store CO2 in those aquifers as long as we produce those water. And producing those waters is very valuable commodity because India needs a lot of water resources at the surface level. And we have established a process of simulation, lab work, field implementation that we applied on this project. So in the interest of time, I'm not going to go over some of the patents that we received and some of the papers that we published. We're going to go directly into some of the great projects that the industry has. This is Chevron's big project in the Gorgon field. They have done a superb job. And it's not only because of the enhanced oil recovery that these projects are successful. They are successful as CCS projects. And yes, there will be some challenges on projects like this. But what I understand from the public information that they were able to solve those challenges and making the project very, very successful. One of the projects and this is information from the public domain that I was personally involved with, was the methane injection project in the Agbami field for Chevron offshore deep water. And what it shows here, that even with methane injection, you can make some of these projects very successful, and the company had to do it because the Nigerian government had restriction of not flaring the gas at the surface. So they had to inject the gas. But we were fortunate. The reservoir has a dip angle of 30 degrees. It's a very light oil, and the injection gas is completely miscible with oil. First contact miscibility. So really, you have a great opportunity to do projects like this, and a very successful project. And I'm very proud of showing this, although my information is from the public domain, because I was involved in the initial design of this project. And this project, $5 billion capital project, very successful, producing over 225,000 barrels of oil per day for the last 10, 12 years at a flat rate almost. This is, we were also very lucky at the University of Houston here to receive a $6 million grant from the governor of Texas and the chancellor of the University of Houston. That was really helpful for my research lab. So we have been able to establish a great Millennium CCS. We'll be showing it to you tomorrow, EOR projects, and we can, and not only myself, but my colleagues also have similar labs, and really together we can do great jobs for CCS and CCUS related to EOR. Okay, great opportunities for us. Next generation CO2 EOR and storage technologies. But I want to spend a little bit time on one slide that I prepared just a few days ago that I want to share with you, that what we can learn from CCS, from EOR projects that we can apply to CCS projects, okay? And another big advantage we have is 45Q, tax incentives. So that's going to play a very, very important role for us. But even with CO2 EOR projects, when you go to field implementation, life is not going to be that easy at high pressure, high temperature. Most of the projects at this point in time on CCUS EOR is at cold temperatures in the Permian Basin, where depth is lower, reservoir temperature is lower. But when you go to very high depth and when you go to very high temperature, then the challenges are there. So I want to mention this also, that it's not an easy solution. It's a constantly challenging situation that we have to be very, very careful about. So there are things that we can do. Where is the current stage? And what are the kind of things we can do? But I feel what it will take for us to move the needle in the CCUS areas is when the operating companies take a leading role. When the operating companies adopt this thing by sincerely adopting and doing the projects in the field, like what they are doing in the Gorgon field, like what they are doing in Canada, that they have to adopt it, and with or without tax advantage or tax incentives, if they can make those projects work. And if anybody can make those projects work, it's going to be the operating companies, because they have the expertise, they have the capitals, they have the people. And universities like ourselves in Utah, we can play a very important role in supporting them. So I'm going to go to my final slide in the interest of time. And basically, what my final slide says, that what CO2 EOR has already taught us about permanently storing carbon. Number one, comparison between CCS and CO2 EOR based on analyzing field data. We can do numerical modeling, we can do lab work, we can work with knowledge that we have gained from the injection wells, the knowledge that we have gained from surveillance and monitoring. And keeping our fingers crossed, no detectable cap rock breaches and practically no surface leaks related to CO2 EOR in the last 50 years. That speaks very highly of the operating companies working in this area. However, we must realize that the timelines between CCS and CO2 EOR is quite different. CO2 EOR projects are for 50 years or less. CCS, we have to look at order of magnitude larger in terms of time. External boundaries between CCS and CO2 EOR, there are some differences. And CCS, we have to consider water production. That's what we have learned from our Indian projects. Next, CO2 EOR is subject to a smaller volumetric sweep because of large mobility and formation heterogeneities. 40 years ago, we were always trying to minimize the amount of CO2 injection in the reservoir because we didn't have enough CO2 available. Today, we have plenty of CO2 available. So we don't have to minimize the amount of CO2 be injected in the reservoirs. We need to maximize the amount of CO2 injection and retain those in the reservoir, therefore increasing our volumetric sweep. The source of CO2 differs. And in my opinion, as I pointed out earlier, about 80 million tons of CO2 can be transferred to anthropogenic CO2 today with the right government incentives, with the right kind of political environment. Therefore, there is a great opportunities to improve these things. Of course, there is a difference in economics in CCS and CO2 EOR. Almost all the CO2 EOR projects today are economically very successful. CCS, question mark. And an obvious product of commerce and storage is CO2 EOR itself. CO2 stored versus oil produced. When we look at the net zero, Dr. Millen, from that point of view. However, we have an opportunity not only in the reservoirs, but also in the aquifers if we produce water. And last but not the least, lessons learned from the reservoir management aspects of fluid injection. We, in the petroleum industry, inject water and gas all over the world. We inject onshore, we inject offshore. And we are very successful. And you saw some of the examples here. And we can transfer those expertise to CCS. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That concludes my talk.